Putin is already thinking about the steps that will lead him to 2030, when the next Kremlin leadership elections are supposed to take place. However, despite all this so-called inevitability, Putin's new presidential term has become the subject of extremely limited discussion both inside and outside of Russia. And this is all the more surprising given that Putin's regime is perhaps now more unstable than ever before, with little prospect of solving Russia's growing economic problems and a rising number of deaths on the battlefields in Ukraine. In the summer of 2023, Russia witnessed an unexpected coup led by Putin's chef, who almost marched on Moscow. In the fall, there were turbulent antisemitic riots that no one suppressed, and protests flared up in usually calm places such as Bashkortostan. No one can say what these events portend. But it is clear that the war in Ukraine has helped make the internal situation in Russia less stable than it has been in decades. And all sorts of potential future scenarios no longer seem impossible. And now is the perfect time to think about them. At the very least, by considering possible scenarios and the likelihood of them occurring in the near future, the West can begin to prepare accordingly, especially in terms of strategy and policy. After all, we know a lot about Russia's past and much about its present. But what about Russia's future? The reputable American publication Politico has examined 5 possible scenarios for the Russian Federation after the elections, which Russia may or may not experience by the end of Putin's next term in 2030. The editorial team of the Ukrainian channel Reposters created an abridged adaptation of this material in Ukrainian, but we also decided to make a Russian language version for the channel KREMLIN. Subscribe to both channels, like the videos, and leave your comments. Especially since some of Politico's points are quite controversial, so it will be interesting to read your thoughts. If you want to support our channels financially, you can do so via Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. But most importantly, send your donations to the armed forces of Ukraine. So, scenario number 1, which is quite unexpected. Democracy flourishes in Russia. Politico estimates the probability of this scenario at 5 to 10%. The anti-communist and anti-colonial revolutions of 1989 showed that totalitarian regimes can quickly collapse in the face of democratic challenges. Putin's mistakes in Ukraine have caused discontent in parts of society, increasing interest in democratic alternatives. The death of Navalny in prison, who could have led democratic movements, has almost destroyed democratic hopes in the country. However, his transformation into a martyr may revive the movement for democracy. Together with other protests, including those organized by soldiers' families, there is a possibility for a democratic surge. However, the chances for change before 2030 are minimal. Navalny's role was unique, but his death and the subsequent repressions have reduced the prospects for the development of democracy. Russians mostly remain passive or support the regime, despite the conflict in Ukraine. To encourage democracy in Russia, the West should be cautious and avoid making hasty conclusions. A Ukrainian victory could weaken Russian nationalism and prompt democratic changes. The West should be open to lifting sanctions in exchange for reforms and should promote the development of relations with Russia's neighbors. It is important not to place all hopes on a single leader, as was done with Navalny, considering his nationalist views and personal weaknesses. This should serve as a lesson not to ignore the depth of Russian imperialism. Scenario number 2, the collapse of Russia. The probability is 10 to 15%. Similar to the historical periods of the collapse of the Russian Empire and the USSR, modern Russia may face mass protests and ethno-national division in the context of a prolonged war. Regions and peoples drawn into the conflict may seek independence or greater autonomy, citing historical precedents of independence following the collapse of large empires. Although some analysts consider such a scenario impossible due to Putin's strong grip on power, underestimating the potential for collapse would be a mistake. Conflicts in Chechnya, Tatarstan, and other regions could spark a broader anti-colonial movement. At the same time, economic and environmental problems are intensifying dissatisfaction with the authorities. The West should support democratic initiatives within Russia and prepare for possible territorial reorganization, taking into account the country's complex multi-ethnic structure and its colonial past. It is important to ensure the security of the nuclear arsenal in the event of possible chaos, drawing on the experience from the collapse of the USSR. Scenario number 3, nationalist uprising. Probability 15 to 20%. Until recently, the possibility of a nationalist uprising threatening Moscow seemed unrealistic. However, events such as the Kornilov affair and the 1991 coup point to historical precedents. Yevgeny Prigozhin's march on Moscow in 2023, although it did not achieve its goal, revealed Putin's vulnerability. The killing of Prigozhin, likely an act of revenge by Putin, does not change the fact that the main causes of discontent remain: military failures, the country's depletion of resources, and economic inequality. However, the uncertainty of such a scenario is not obvious. Prigozhin's uniqueness as a public opponent of Putin and the disbandment of his forces make a repeat of such events less likely. Putin, by intensifying nationalist rhetoric, only complicates the challenges for potential contenders from the right-wing spectrum. The West must be prepared for the possibility of a change of power in Russia toward a more nationalist regime. It is important to strengthen sanctions, maintain diplomatic ties with Russia's neighbors, and prepare to contain Moscow's new expansionist policies by drawing on Cold War experience. Scenario number 4. Technocratic reboot. Probability 20 to 25%. After 2 years of Russia's unsuccessful invasion of Ukraine, economic losses and human casualties are mounting, increasing the likelihood of a change in power. The analogy with the ousting of Nikita Khrushchev in 1964 suggests a possible repetition of history where the Kremlin's inner circle might decide to send Putin into retirement. The prospect of a change in power before 2030 increases, with a potential successor who may not necessarily be a Democrat, but who would represent the Western-educated technocratic elites. These new leaders may place the blame for the war on Putin, promising a return to normalcy and the possible release of political prisoners. However, the transition from authoritarianism to technocratic governance will require significant energy and resources, since dictators like Putin tend to cling to power by using the entire state apparatus. With his broad support among official circles and a potential military victory in Ukraine, Putin can easily thwart any coup attempt. What should the West do? In the event of a transition to more technocratic leadership, the West should maintain a strategy of skepticism, keeping in mind previous attempts to reset relations with Russia. At the same time, it is necessary to support democratic reforms and demand that Russia compensate for its actions in Ukraine, while also preparing for a possible return to authoritarian methods of governance. Scenario number 5. The Eternal Putin. Probability 45 to 50%. This scenario, in which Putin remains in power, has always seemed the most likely. Given Putin's control over the situation even under external pressure and internal challenges, he may not only complete his current term but also extend his rule. The death of Navalny and the relative stability of the Russian economy, despite sanctions, play into Putin's hands. At 71 years old, he has the potential to stay in the game for a long time to come. However, the next term may be the most difficult for Putin due to economic stagnation and the consequences of the war in Ukraine. These factors may intensify both internal and external challenges to his regime. What should the West do? The West should increase pressure on Russia using all available means. Tightening sanctions, restricting prices on hydrocarbons, and confiscating the Russian central bank's assets must continue. It is also important to deepen relations with countries neighboring Russia, fostering democratic processes. Support for Ukraine and recognition of the long-term threat posed by Russian aggression remain key. Understanding that Putin in power means the continuation of the war in Ukraine should motivate the West to use all possible tools to support changes in Russian leadership while preparing for possible further challenges. These 5 scenarios open up a wide range of possible futures for Russia, each with its own prerequisites, trajectories, and of course, its own risks and opportunities not only for Russia, but for the entire world. The scenario of a flourishing democracy in Russia may seem almost utopian, but the potential of society for change should not be underestimated. The collapse of the country, on the other hand, opens Pandora's box of national and ethnic issues. Historical precedents, both in the 20th century and after the collapse of the USSR, highlight the risks and the potential for chaos in such a scenario. A nationalist surge underscores the dilemma between unity and discord in a multi-ethnic society. This scenario may point to the danger of escalating internal and external conflicts. A technocratic reboot might seem like the most civilized way out of the crisis. But it is important to remember here that technocracy without democracy can easily turn into a new authoritarianism. The Eternal Putin scenario reflects the inertia of the current political system. However, it also emphasizes that even the strongest regimes are not immune to external and internal challenges. None of these scenarios is inevitable, and each has its own conditions for realization. As history teaches us, the future is neither linear nor predictable, and it depends on the choices made not only by those in power but also by society. Perhaps the most important takeaway from this Politico analysis is the understanding that Russia's future lies not only in the hands of its rulers, but also in the collective actions and choices of its people, as well as in the responsible approach of the international community to these processes. And what do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments and share this video.